Benjamin Franklin wasn't just a genius inventor or statesman. He was a man who believed food could shape a nation.
Brown the lamb cubes carefully in a small amount of cooking oil and add your favorite combination of vegetables.
At his Philadelphia table, every dish carried meaning. Cornmeal pancakes with honey showed his love for American crops. Roast turkey, which he once argued should be our national bird, reflected his wit and patriotism. And then there were surprises. Tofu, Parmesan cheesecake, even champagne with pastries from Paris. This wasn't ordinary dining. Franklin's meals blended native traditions, colonial staples, and European delicacies, creating a table that told the story of America's birth.
Other use-again lamb dishes include cold sliced lamb sandwiches, great for lunchbox excitement.
Each plate held survival, innovation, and a taste of rebellion. So today, we're stepping into Franklin's dining room. 30 foods that fueled a founding father and, in their own way, a revolution. Stick with me because the dishes at his table may change the way you see both history and dinner. Cornmeal, pancakes with honey, or maple syrup. Let's start simple but powerful. Cornmeal pancakes. Franklin adored maize, or as we call it, corn, not just because it was tasty, but because it was American through and through. Unlike wheat, which had to be shipped across the ocean at high cost, corn grew strong right in Pennsylvania soil. It was cheap, filling, and dependable. Exactly the kind of ingredient Franklin admired. Picture the scene. A skillet on a colonial hearth, batter sizzling, the sweet smell rising as golden cakes stack higher and higher. But instead of imported sugar, scarce and expensive, Franklin favored local sweeteners. A drizzle of wild honey, or better yet, maple syrup tapped from American trees, a flavor no European rival could match. Here's the part most people forget. Franklin wasn't just eating breakfast, he was making a statement. By choosing corn and maple, he was showing that the colonies could feed themselves, no longer chained to European imports. Succotash. If cornmeal pancakes were Franklin's nod to colonial thrift, succotash was his salute to native wisdom. This dish, a humble mix of corn, beans, and squash, picture his Philadelphia table, roasted meats, fine wines, silverware glinting, and right beside them a bowl of succotash. At first glance, it looked simple, but Franklin understood the genius. Corn provided energy, beans packed in protein, and squash gave both flavor and vitamins. Together, they created a complete meal, one that sustained communities for centuries before the colonies even existed. Franklin didn't just enjoy it, he promoted it. To him, succotash wasn't poor man's food. It was proof that America could sustain itself from its own land. In a world where Europe clung to bread and wheat, Franklin saw corn and beans as the true American grain, a culinary declaration of independence. But there's a twist. While Franklin loved native flavors, he also had a sweet tooth. In fact, he often requested a certain tart little berry drizzled with maple syrup that reminded him of New England winters. And that simple dish carried more weight than just dessert. Cranberries with maple syrup. Franklin may have been a man of science, but he also had a sentimental side, and nothing proved that more than his love for cranberries. These tart red berries, native to New England, became a dish he mentioned in letters, often with a request to send them overseas. Imagine being in London or Paris and craving the sharp bite of cranberries sweetened with a drizzle of maple syrup, a taste of home he simply couldn't let go of. At his Philadelphia table, cranberries weren't just a seasonal side dish. They were a statement of identity. They reminded Franklin and his guests that America had flavors unlike anywhere else in the world. No French wine, no British pudding could match the wild rustic tang of cranberries mixed with the sweetness of maple. It was a blend of tart and sweet, survival and comfort. Cranberries weren't only about nostalgia. Franklin saw them as practical medicine, too, believing they helped ward off scurvy on long voyages. So when he spooned up those ruby-red berries at dinner, it wasn't just pleasure. And speaking of drinks, Franklin had another colonial favorite that became an obsession. But this one didn't come from the fields or forests. It came steaming hot from a cup, imported from across the ocean, and carried with it a whole new kind of energy: drinking chocolate. Before coffee took over America, chocolate was the drink of choice, and Franklin was one of its greatest fans. He didn't just sip it. He imported cocoa beans himself, and even sold drinking chocolate in his Philadelphia print shop. For Franklin, hot cocoa wasn't a guilty pleasure. It was fuel. Picture the scene. A cold evening in Philadelphia, papers scattered across his desk. Franklin hunched over letters and experiments. Beside him, not a tankard of ale, but a steaming mug of thick spiced chocolate. It was warm, rich, and unlike beer, it sharpened the mind instead of dulling it. Franklin admired that. In fact, he once promoted cocoa as a healthier alternative to traditional colonial drinks, a beverage that kept both body and brain awake. Here's where it gets interesting. Chocolate was expensive, an imported luxury, but Franklin saw value beyond indulgence. He recognized its power for soldiers, too. During the French and Indian War, he suggested cocoa be packed into military supplies, calling it a perfect ration for both strength and comfort. So at Franklin's table, hot cocoa wasn't just dessert. It was innovation in a cup. But if cocoa gave him warmth, another dish gave him pride. A bird he loved so much, he declared it far superior to the bald eagle: roast turkey. If there's one dish that captures Franklin's humor and pride in being American, it's roast turkey. He didn't just enjoy the flavor. He once famously argued that the turkey, not the bald eagle, should be America's national bird. Why? Because he thought the eagle was a lazy scavenger, while the turkey was a noble creature, a bird of courage, as he called it. At Franklin's Philadelphia table, a roast turkey wasn't just dinner. It was symbolism. Picture a golden bird pulled from the hearth, its skin crisp, juices flowing, surrounded by herbs and vegetables. Guests carving slices weren't just eating meat. They were sharing in Franklin's vision of an honest, hard-working America. Here's the part most people forget. Turkey was more than holiday fare back then. For Franklin, it was practical, too. Plentiful, native to the land, and capable of feeding large gatherings. A centerpiece for both family meals and political suppers, where ideas of revolution might have been whispered over gravy and stuffing. There's a twist. For all his love of traditional meats, Franklin's curiosity pushed him toward foods most colonists had never even heard of: tofu. Now, this is where Franklin really surprises us. In 1770, while living in London, he wrote a letter describing something most colonists had never even imagined: cheese made from beans. He was talking about tofu, the first recorded mention of it in American history. Franklin had come across soybeans through his global network of friends and scientists. Intrigued by this strange curd from Asia, he asked for instructions on how to make it, even suggesting it could one day be valuable for America. Imagine that. Decades before tofu ever reached mainstream kitchens, Franklin was already curious about its potential. Here's the kicker. Franklin wasn't just dabbling in food trends. He saw tofu as a solution. It was cheap, protein-rich, and made from plants, a practical alternative in a world where meat wasn't always available. For a man who believed diet shaped both body and society, tofu represented innovation on a plate. Now picture the contrast. One evening, Franklin might enjoy roast turkey with Madeira wine. Another night, he might be jotting down notes about soybean cheese, thinking of how it could nourish a growing nation. That was Franklin, never content with the ordinary. And while tofu was rare, one fruit he loved was anything but. In fact, he valued it so much he had barrels of it shipped across the ocean. a crisp, sweet reminder of home. Apple-based dishes. Franklin's love for apples ran deep, so deep that he once arranged for barrels of them to be shipped across the Atlantic while he was abroad. To him, apples weren't just fruit. They were comfort, memory, and a link back to home. On his Philadelphia table, apples showed up in all sorts of ways. Baked whole with butter and spice, tucked into pies with flaky crusts, or boiled down into puddings. Each preparation told a story of abundance in a land where orchards flourished. Unlike exotic fruits that had to be imported at high cost, apples were everywhere, hardy, versatile, and perfectly suited to colonial kitchens. Here's the hidden truth. Franklin admired apples not just for their taste, but for their staying power. They could be stored through winter, dried for voyages, or pressed into cider, a drink nearly every household made. In a world before refrigeration, that kind of dependability mattered, and Franklin, ever the philosopher, saw lessons in them. He wrote that eating wisely, choosing wholesome local foods like apples, was a virtue, not just a diet. It reflected the self-reliance he believed America needed. Potato dishes. Potatoes may feel ordinary to us now, but in Franklin's day they were still a curiosity, even a little suspicious. Many Europeans avoided them, fearing they caused disease, but Franklin, true to form, saw their potential long before most of his peers. During his time in France, Franklin actually promoted the potato as a crop that could help feed the poor and stabilize nations. He believed it was hearty, affordable, and far too useful to ignore. In a letter, he even praised a French scientist who hosted banquets featuring nothing but potatoes to prove their value. Franklin, of course, applauded the idea. On his Philadelphia table, potatoes likely showed up in simple, hearty ways, boiled with herbs, mashed with butter, or roasted alongside meats. They weren't extravagant, but they were filling, dependable, and practical. Exactly the kind of food Franklin admired, and, for a man who balanced indulgence with moderation, potatoes fit perfectly into his philosophy of eating well without excess. But here's the twist. Franklin didn't just look at food as sustenance, he saw it as science. He wasn't just chewing on potatoes, he was chewing on the idea that crops like these could change the fate of nations. And, speaking of experiments, Franklin wasn't only writing about vegetables. Milk punch. Now, here's where Franklin's playful side shines through. Among his papers, you'll actually find a full recipe for something called milk punch. It sounds odd at first, mixing milk with liquor, but in Franklin's day it was considered both refined and practical. The recipe went like this. Take brandy or rum, blend it with milk, sugar, lemon, and spices. Then strain it until smooth. What you got was a surprisingly clear, silky drink that could be bottled and stored for months without spoiling. Perfect for a man who loved entertaining guests, but didn't always want to be tied to the kitchen. Franklin liked it so much he printed it and shared it with friends overseas. In his mind, milk punch wasn't just tasty, it was science at work. The curdling and straining process fascinated him, and he saw it as another example of how knowledge and pleasure could go hand in hand. Imagine his Philadelphia gatherings, glasses clinking with this creamy yet crisp punch, laughter bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. The drink itself a symbol of Franklin's ingenuity. It wasn't just refreshment, it was hospitality, invention, and practicality all in one. But Franklin didn't stop at drinks. Right beside that punch bowl, he often served another favorite, succotash-like corn bean salad. If Franklin loved one thing above all in food, it was practicality, and nothing embodied that more than succotash, or as he sometimes spelled it, succotash. This dish was simple. Corn kernels, beans, and maybe a splash of butter or herbs. Yet in its simplicity, it carried incredible meaning. On his Philadelphia table, a bowl of this corn bean salad wasn't just filler. It was a nod to native ingenuity, a reminder of the three sisters that sustained entire communities long before the colonies. Franklin admired the balance. The corn gave energy, the beans gave protein, and together they formed a complete, nourishing dish. Here's the twist. Franklin didn't just eat it, he recommended it to others. Succotash was proof that America didn't need to depend on European imports to thrive. It was healthy, local, and endlessly adaptable, and he believed meals like this helped shape a more independent, self-sufficient people. Exactly what the colonies needed in the years leading to revolution. Now, imagine Franklin hosting fellow thinkers, philosophers, and politicians. Among the wine, roasted meats, and fine desserts, a simple dish of corn and beans quietly sat on the table. As much a political statement as it was dinner, chicken fricassee. When Franklin entertained in Philadelphia, he didn't just serve plain roasts. He also enjoyed refined dishes like chicken fricassee, a recipe straight from European kitchens but adapted with colonial flair. Think of tender chicken pieces simmered in a creamy sauce with butter, herbs, and maybe a splash of wine. It was the kind of dish that showed Franklin's table balanced both elegance and comfort. Here's the scene. The clatter of pewter plates, a dish of steaming chicken fricassee placed before distinguished guests. Philosophers, politicians, even foreign diplomats. For Franklin, food was diplomacy. Serving something like this said, "We are as cultured as any European court." Yet, by using Pennsylvania-raised poultry and local herbs, the dish also carried that American practicality he loved. The twist? Fricassee was labor-intensive. Unlike a simple roast, it required careful cooking, slow stirring, and a touch of finesse. Having it on the table signaled wealth, skill, and hospitality. Franklin knew it impressed, but Franklin's meals weren't always refined. He also embraced rustic flavors that spoke to thrift and resourcefulness. In fact, one of his most beloved meats was pork, not delicately sauced, but roasted until the skin crackled. Roast pork with crispy crackling. If chicken fricassee showed Franklin's refined side, roast pork with crispy crackling revealed his love of hearty, no-nonsense fare. In colonial Pennsylvania, pork was abundant and practical. Every part of the animal could be used, from hams smoked for winter to sausages and lard for cooking. But nothing made an impression at the table quite like a roasted joint of pork, its skin blistered and crunchy, the juices running into the pan below. Franklin had recipes for pork in his collections, and it wasn't by accident. He valued thrift, and pork was the farmer's friend. Easy to raise, reliable, and versatile. A crackling roast wasn't just delicious, it was symbolic of using resources wisely, a principle Franklin preached often. Imagine the sound of a knife slicing through that crisp golden skin, the tender meat beneath, filling the room with savory aroma. Guests couldn't help but lean forward. But here's the kicker. While pork was humble, Franklin's table wasn't limited to farmhouse staples. He also had a taste for the sea. And sometimes his notes and recipe collections featured something far more luxurious, a dish that required wealth, connections, and no small effort to prepare. Stuffed lobster dish. Now we move from farmhouse pork to pure indulgence. Stuffed lobster. In Franklin's Philadelphia, lobster wasn't everyday food. It was expensive, tricky to transport, and seen as a delicacy reserved for those with means. But Franklin had a taste for it. And among his recipe collections, you'll find notes on preparing lobster dishes, some of them stuffed and baked to impress even the most demanding guest. Picture the spectacle, a bright red lobster cracked open, its shell filled with a rich stuffing of breadcrumbs, herbs, butter, maybe even a splash of wine. Placed on the table, it was as much decoration as dinner. For Franklin, who loved both showmanship and substance, it was the perfect centerpiece. Here's what makes it fascinating. Franklin spent years abroad, especially in France, where fine seafood was a mark of refinement. Bringing lobster dishes back to Philadelphia symbolized more than good taste. It showed that American tables could rival Europe's in sophistication. It was a culinary handshake between the old world and the new. Pepper pot soup. If lobster was a show of wealth, pepper pot was the taste of Philadelphia itself. Known as the soup that won the Revolution, it became famous when Washington's starving troops were served it during the harsh winter at Valley Forge. But even before that, Franklin would have known pepper pot well. It was a staple of his city. This wasn't dainty fare. Pepper pot was bold, thick, and spicy, made with tripe vegetables and hot peppers that gave it its name. West Indian influences shaped the recipe, and Philadelphia cooks adapted it into something hearty enough to keep you warm through bitter winters. Imagine Franklin sitting at his table, a steaming bowl of pepper pot placed before him. The aroma alone told a story of resilience and ingenuity. A dish born from scraps, stretched into a meal that nourished both body and spirit. For Franklin, who admired practicality and resourcefulness, this soup fit perfectly with his ideals. And here's the kicker. While pepper pot became a symbol of common strength, Franklin also loved to indulge in sauces that spoke of elegance. One in particular was a creamy oyster sauce, sometimes poured over meats or tucked into a pie. Rich, refined, and unforgettable. Oyster sauce over meat or as pie. If there was one flavor Franklin loved to borrow from fine European dining, it was oysters, but not always raw on the half-shell. In his day, oysters often showed up transformed into rich sauces or tucked into pies, turning a simple meal into something grand. Imagine slices of beef or veal, steaming hot, draped in a creamy oyster sauce made with butter, cream, and a dash of nutmeg. Or picture a flaky pastry pie, its filling brimming with oysters and herbs, the aroma filling the dining room before the first bite was even taken. For Franklin, dishes like this represented refinement. Philadelphia had easy access to oysters from the Delaware Bay, making them abundant. But when combined with French techniques, they became a statement. America could hold its own at the table of kings. While Franklin delighted in these refined flavors, he never abandoned simpler sweets. One dessert in particular often found its way to his table, an apple pudding boiled in pastry, hearty, rustic, and distinctly colonial. Boiled puff, pastry apple pudding. Franklin's sweet tooth leaned toward the practical, and few desserts captured colonial ingenuity better than boiled apple pudding. Forget ovens and fancy molds. This was a dessert made by wrapping apples and spices in pastry, tying it up in a cloth, and boiling it right in a pot of water. When unwrapped, the pudding emerged soft, fragrant, and comforting, a humble but hearty treat. Apples were plentiful in Pennsylvania, and pastry could be stretched thin to make the fruit go further. Exactly the kind of resourcefulness Franklin admired. Here's the kicker. This pudding wasn't just dessert, it was survival food dressed up for company. The boiling method meant it could be prepared over open hearths, even in modest kitchens, and still come out tasting indulgent. Franklin loved that balance. Modest ingredients transformed into something memorable. But while apple puddings were rustic, Franklin also embraced the finer side of French patisserie, and one dessert he would have encountered abroad was light, delicate, and floating in a pool of cream, the elegant il flottante. Il flottante. From the rustic to the refined, Franklin's sweet tooth took him far beyond apple puddings. During his years in France, he encountered a dessert so light and delicate it felt almost magical. Il flottante, or floating islands. Imagine soft, airy meringues poached until pillowy, then set adrift in a pool of silky vanilla custard. A dusting of caramel or nutmeg on top made the whole thing shimmer like a jewel on the table. Franklin adored these kinds of French innovations. To him, they represented more than flavor. They were proof of how science and art could merge in the kitchen. The chemistry of whipping egg whites into stiff peaks, the gentle cooking that kept them afloat. It was exactly the kind of experimentation Franklin loved. And when Franklin paired such desserts with French wines and sparkling champagne, the effect wasn't just indulgence, it was international flair. Champagne with Patisseries. If floating islands showed Franklin's appreciation for French finesse, champagne with pastries revealed his full embrace of European luxury. During his years in Paris as America's diplomat, Franklin was wined and dined in salons and palaces, surrounded by fine foods and sparkling glasses. He didn't just attend, he enjoyed every sip. Picture Franklin raising a flute of golden champagne, bubbles rising as he nibbled delicate French patisseries. But Franklin believed in balance. He preached moderation, yet he also understood the importance of indulgence, especially when it built connections with France, America's crucial ally. Here's the twist. Champagne wasn't just a drink to Franklin, it was diplomacy. Sharing a toast over patisseries wasn't merely about taste, it was about trust, friendship, and winning support for the revolution. But Franklin didn't just enjoy French luxuries, he also studied them. In fact, he took a keen interest in one specific ingredient, Parmesan cheese, and his curiosity about it led him down a path that even today feels surprisingly modern. Parmesan cheesecake. Now, here's a dish that perfectly captures Franklin's curiosity. Parmesan cheesecake. Strange as it sounds, Franklin was fascinated by Parmesan, so much so that he once tried to secure the secrets of its production. He admired it as both a delicacy and a scientific puzzle. How did Italian cheesemakers achieve that flavor and texture? Imagine him in Philadelphia serving guests a cheesecake not made with the usual soft curds, but flavored with sharp, nutty Parmesan. It would have been unexpected, rich, and a conversation starter. And Franklin loved conversation at the table as much as he loved the food itself. Franklin saw in Parmesan the potential for American agriculture. If the colonies could learn the methods of making world-class cheese, they wouldn't have to depend on costly imports. But after rich cheesecakes and champagne, Franklin also valued balance. That meant keeping something simpler on the table, like a colorful platter of pickled vegetables, sharp, tangy, and distinctly colonial. Pickled vegetable platter. For all his love of roasts, puddings, and rich sauces, Franklin also believed in balance, and that's where a plate of pickled vegetables came in. Cucumbers, beets, onions, all preserved in brine or vinegar, were common at elite colonial tables, and Franklin's was no exception. These weren't just colorful sides. In a world without refrigeration, pickling meant survival. A platter of sharp, tangy pickles cut through the heaviness of meats and puddings, refreshed the palate, and carried vitamins through the winter months. Franklin, ever the practical philosopher, admired foods that were both tasty and useful, and pickling was exactly that, thrift and pleasure in one. But here's the hidden truth. Dishes like this also reflected Franklin's values. He mocked gluttony, preached moderation, and appreciated foods that kept people healthy without extravagance. Pickled vegetables were the perfect symbol of that philosophy, and when Franklin wanted to pair health with comfort, he didn't stop at pickles. He turned back to his favorite fruit, apples, this time tucked into one of the colony's most beloved desserts, dumplings swimming in cream. Apple dumplings with cream sauce. Few dishes captured colonial comfort better than apple dumplings. These weren't the delicate pastries you might picture today. In Franklin's Philadelphia, they were hearty, whole apples wrapped in dough, boiled or baked until tender, then drenched in cream or sweet sauce. To Franklin, who adored apples in all forms, this was pure seasonal joy. Imagine a guest at his table cutting into a steaming dumpling, the crust giving way to soft, spiced apple inside, juices spilling out into the cream. It was rustic, filling, and deeply nostalgic, the kind of dessert that made even a founding father feel like a boy again. Apples were everywhere in Pennsylvania, so dumplings became a democratic dish. Simple enough for a farm kitchen, yet satisfying enough for Franklin's refined gatherings. Here's the kicker. Apple dumplings were also practical. They used ingredients most families already had, flour, apples, milk, and turned them into something special without much waste. Franklin admired that thrift and often praised foods that stretched resources. At the same time, he delighted in sharing them with friends abroad, writing of apples and their many uses as proof of America's bounty. But Franklin's sweet tooth didn't stop at dumplings. He also enjoyed more refined pastry-like creations that echoed Europe's sophistication, one of them being oyster patties wrapped in golden puff pastry. Oyster patties in puff pastry. Now we're back to refinement, the kind of dish Franklin might have served when he wanted to impress European guests or Philadelphia's elite. Oyster patties were small golden parcels of puff pastry filled with creamy oyster stew and baked until flaky and delicate. They were bite-sized luxuries, rich with butter and the briny sweetness of fresh oysters from the Delaware Bay. Picture Franklin's dining table. Alongside hearty corn dishes and rustic dumplings sat these elegant little patties, shining with gloss from the oven. To his guests, they were proof that colonial kitchens could rival French ones in both taste and style. For Franklin, they represented his love of blending practicality with indulgence. Oysters were local and abundant, yet wrapped in pastry, they became a dish of sophistication. Here's the hidden truth. Franklin often used food to build bridges. Serving oyster patties wasn't only about flavor, it was a kind of culinary diplomacy. They made Americans look polished, worldly, and inventive at a time when Europe doubted the colony's refinement. But while these buttery pastries showed elegance, Franklin's table also featured heavier old-world puddings that spoke of tradition and wealth. One of the richest of them all was a marrow pudding, spiced with nutmeg and sweetened to impress. Marrow pudding with nutmeg. If oyster patties spoke of elegance, marrow pudding spoke of richness. This was no light dessert. It was dense, sweet, and made with bone marrow, eggs, sugar, and warm spices like nutmeg. In Franklin's Philadelphia, puddings like this were considered luxurious, a sign of wealth and status since they required both refined sugar and plenty of eggs. Two costly ingredients. Picture the scene. A dish brought to Franklin's table, golden and fragrant, cut into slices that glistened with buttery marrow. Guests tasted not just sweetness, but the indulgence of a kitchen willing to use every resource, even the marrow from bones, to craft something special. The preparation of marrow pudding required patience and skill. Bones had to be cracked or sawn to extract the soft, fatty marrow inside. This marrow, creamy and rich, was then beaten together with egg yolks, sugar, breadcrumbs, and sometimes cream until it formed a thick, smooth mixture. Nutmeg was grated fresh, its warm, slightly sweet aroma filling the kitchen. Some recipes added a splash of brandy or rosewater, elevating the pudding even further. The mixture was then poured into a buttered dish or mold and baked slowly until it set. The top would turn golden brown, sometimes developing a slight crust, while the interior remained soft and custardy. When served warm, marrow pudding had an almost molten quality, each spoonful dissolving on the tongue with buttery sweetness. For Franklin, who admired thrift but also loved good food, marrow pudding balanced practicality with decadence. Nothing was wasted, yet nothing was ordinary either. Butchers often discarded or sold marrow bones cheaply, since extracting the marrow required effort most home cooks avoided. But those willing to do the work gained access to one of the richest, most flavorful ingredients available. Marrow itself was prized in colonial cooking. It added unctuousness to dishes, a silky quality that butter alone couldn't achieve. In an era before modern fats and oils, marrow represented a valuable cooking resource. Franklin's kitchen used it in savory dishes, too, enriching soups, moistening roasted meats, even spreading on toast as a delicacy. But in marrow pudding, it became something transcendent. Combined with sugar and spices, the savory richness of marrow transformed into something dessert-like. Though unlike any modern sweet, the flavor was complex, almost meaty underneath the sweetness, with the nutmeg adding warmth and the eggs providing structure. Here's the twist. Nutmeg wasn't local. It was imported, expensive, and exotic. The spice came from tiny islands in Indonesia, traveling thousands of miles through multiple hands before reaching Philadelphia markets. For centuries, European powers fought wars over nutmeg-producing islands. The spice was literally worth more than gold by weight during certain periods. Having nutmeg on the table showed Franklin's connections to global trade and his appetite for the world's flavors. Each grating of nutmeg over marrow pudding represented vast networks of ships, merchants, and trade routes that connected Philadelphia to the far corners of the earth. Franklin, who spent years abroad and corresponded with people on every continent, understood these connections intimately. A spoonful of pudding with nutmeg wasn't just dessert, it was a bite of empire, a reminder that America's tables were tied to the farthest corners of the world. The marrow came from local cattle, yes, but the sugar likely arrived from Caribbean plantations, the nutmeg from Indonesian islands. Even the eggs, though laid by Pennsylvania hens, came from chickens whose ancestors had been brought from Europe generations earlier. This global interconnection fascinated Franklin. He saw it not as dependence, but as opportunity. The same trade networks that brought nutmeg to Philadelphia could carry American goods, wheat, timber, furs, back out into the world. Marrow pudding, in its own way, represented the colonial economy in miniature. Beef tongue with mustard glaze. Here's a dish that might surprise modern eaters, but was a mark of elegance in Franklin's day. Beef tongue with mustard glaze. In the 18th century, tongue wasn't viewed as scraps or offcuts. It was considered refined, especially when dressed up with a sharp golden sauce. Franklin, who believed in thrift but also loved flavor, would have appreciated a dish that turned something humble into something worthy of his table. Picture it, a tender tongue, carefully boiled and sliced, then brushed with a glaze of mustard, vinegar, and spice until it gleamed. Served alongside roasts and puddings, it gave Franklin's guests a taste both hearty and polished, and mustard was no afterthought. Franklin adored it, even writing about seeds and condiments, fascinated by their punch and preservation power. The preparation of beef tongue required knowledge passed down through generations. First came the cooking. A whole tongue, weighing several pounds, needed to be boiled for hours until tender. Bay leaves, peppercorns, and onions went into the cooking water, flavoring the meat as it simmered. The long, slow cooking transformed the tongue from a tough muscle into something meltingly tender. Once cooked, the tongue's outer skin had to be peeled away while still warm. This revealed the pale, smooth meat underneath. Some cooks served it whole as a centerpiece, while others sliced it into rounds that showed off its unique texture. The meat had a dense quality, more uniform than other cuts, with a subtle, slightly sweet flavor that made it perfect for assertive sauces. The mustard glaze elevated everything, made from ground mustard seed, vinegar, a touch of honey or sugar, and sometimes additional spices like cloves or ginger. The glaze provided sharp contrast to the tongue's mild richness. When brushed on and briefly heated, the glaze thickened and caramelized slightly, coating each slice with glossy golden sauce. Here's the kicker. This dish symbolized Franklin's duality. He admired using every part of an animal, wasting nothing, but he also relished transforming those parts into delicacies. A glazed tongue wasn't just resourceful, it was impressive, showing how colonial cooks could turn necessity into sophistication. Tongue represented exactly the kind of ingredient Franklin's philosophy celebrated. Many people ignored it, considering it too strange or too much work, but those willing to learn the proper technique gained access to meat that was tender, flavorful, and relatively inexpensive compared to prime cuts. It rewarded skill and knowledge rather than wealth alone. Franklin's interest in mustard went beyond mere taste. He found the plant itself fascinating. Mustard seeds were tiny but powerful, their pungency locked inside until crushed. and mixed with liquid. The chemical reaction that produced mustard's characteristic heat intrigued him. It was transformation through science, kitchen chemistry that anyone could observe. He also appreciated mustard's preservation properties. Before refrigeration, mustard helped preserve foods and disguise flavors that had begun to turn. Mixed into sauces, it could extend the life of meat dishes. Ground and mixed with vinegar, it became a condiment that itself would keep for months. Franklin saw practicality and pleasure combined, exactly his preference. Serving beef tongue with mustard glaze at his table sent multiple messages to guests. First, that Franklin's household valued skillful cooking over expensive ingredients. Second, that American tables didn't need to copy European aristocracy's habits of waste and excess. Third, that intelligence and technique could make humble ingredients into something special. The dish also reflected colonial realities. Butchers sold every part of slaughtered animals. Nothing went to waste when meat was expensive and butchering infrequent. Families who bought whole or half animals needed recipes for every cut, including tongue, heart, liver, and other organs. Cookbooks of the era included detailed instructions for preparing these cuts, treating them as normal fare rather than curiosities. Franklin's table showcased this practical approach while maintaining refinement. The same meal might feature a crown roast and a glazed tongue, expensive oyster pie, and economical kidney pie. This range demonstrated the host's versatility and sent a subtle message about American identity. Unlike Europe's rigid class distinctions, where nobles and commoners ate entirely different foods, Franklin's table suggested a middle path, quality available to anyone with skill, not just anyone with wealth, and Franklin's sweet tooth couldn't resist ending such a meal with something creamy, rich, and indulgent. Custards and pots de crème, smooth, delicate desserts were the final flourish, closing his table on a note of refinement. Pot de crème, or custard desserts, Franklin believed a meal should end with satisfaction, not excess, and few desserts embodied that balance better than custards. At his table you might find a simple baked custard flavored with nutmeg, or even the French-inspired pot de crème he encountered abroad, a silky, smooth pudding served in small cups, rich with cream, eggs, and just enough sweetness to feel indulgent. Picture the glow of candles in Franklin's dining room, the chatter of guests winding down after a feast of turkey, oysters, puddings, and wine. Then comes the custard, creamy, delicate, spooned slowly, each bite a gentle close to the evening. For Franklin, this was more than dessert. It was philosophy in practice, moderation, refinement, and pleasure in its simplest form. Here's the hidden truth. Custards reflected Franklin's fascination with science. They relied on precise cooking, eggs thickened just right, heat carefully controlled, turning kitchen work into chemistry. It was exactly the kind of culinary experiment that appealed to the man who flew kites in storms and bottled milk punch. The transformation of liquid into solid through heat and time mirrored his broader belief that patient observation and careful method could unlock nature's secrets. Franklin's custards weren't accidental successes. He understood ratios, the proportion of eggs to cream, the temperature of the oven, the timing required to achieve that perfect trembling texture. Too hot and the eggs would scramble, too cool and they'd never set. This delicate balance fascinated him. In many ways, custard making paralleled his diplomatic work. Both required patience, precision, and the understanding that forcing things too quickly led to disaster. When Franklin served pot de crème to French guests, he wasn't just offering dessert, he was showing them that Americans understood refinement, that colonial hands could produce results as elegant as any Parisian kitchen. And when he served simple baked custard to Philadelphia neighbors, he demonstrated that sophistication didn't require pretension. The same principles applied whether the vessel was a humble earthenware bowl or an imported porcelain cup. Preserved fruits in syrup beyond fresh apples and cranberries, Franklin appreciated the art of preservation. Preserved fruits in syrup, cherries, peaches, plums, became staples in wealthy colonial households. These weren't just sweet treats, they were insurance against scarcity, a way to capture summer's abundance and stretch it through harsh winters. Franklin admired the process. Fruit carefully selected, cooked down with sugar until it transformed into something that could last months, even years. At his table, a dish of preserved peaches glistening in golden syrup represented both foresight and luxury. The initial investment of sugar and labor paid dividends when fresh fruit disappeared from markets. Picture a winter evening in Philadelphia. Snow falling outside, fires crackling inside. Franklin serving guests preserved cherries alongside roasted meats. The bright fruit, a vivid reminder of warmer days. The contrast alone made the meal memorable. The tartness of cherries cutting through rich gravies, the sweetness balancing savory flavors, the jewel-like appearance adding color to a table otherwise dominated by browns and golds. Here's the kicker. Preservation wasn't just practical for Franklin. It was philosophical. He often wrote about preparing for the future, saving resources, thinking ahead. A jar of preserved fruit embodied all those principles. It represented delayed gratification, choosing to save today's abundance for tomorrow's scarcity. It demonstrated foresight, the ability to look beyond immediate pleasure toward future need. In his Poor Richard's Almanac, Franklin wrote countless proverbs about thrift and preparation. A penny saved is a penny earned. Waste not, want not. These weren't abstract concepts to him. They lived in his pantry, in jars of preserved fruit lined up on shelves, waiting for the moment when winter made fresh produce impossible to find. Each jar was a small victory against nature's cycles, proof that human ingenuity could extend summer's bounty into February's cold. The process itself required knowledge passed down through generations. Which fruits held up best in syrup? Peaches, cherries, and plums. Yes, but berries turned to mush. How much sugar was enough to preserve without overwhelming the fruit's natural flavor? Too little, and mold would grow. Too much, and you'd create candy instead of preserved fruit. Franklin appreciated this accumulated wisdom. It represented exactly the kind of practical knowledge he believed made civilization possible. Venison roast with herbs. America's forests provided what European estates could not. Wild game, abundant and free for those skilled enough to hunt it. Venison became a prized dish at Franklin's table, representing both the wilderness that surrounded the colonies and the self-sufficiency he championed. A roasted haunch of deer, rubbed with herbs and slow-cooked until tender, was a centerpiece that told guests they were dining on America's own bounty. Unlike domesticated meats that required land, feed, and constant care, venison came from the wild. It cost nothing but skill and effort. For Franklin, who valued resourcefulness above all, this made it doubly valuable. Picture his dining room. A massive venison roast placed at the center of the table, its rich, earthy aroma filling the space. Guests carved thick slices, the meat darker and leaner than beef, its flavor speaking of forests and freedom. The preparation of venison required knowledge. The meat was lean, lacking the fat that made beef and pork forgiving. Cooked improperly, it became tough and gamey, but treated with care, marinated with herbs, perhaps wrapped in fat, roasted slowly, it became something extraordinary. Rosemary and thyme from Franklin's garden paired perfectly with venison's natural flavor. Bay leaves added depth. A crust of cracked pepper provided bite. Here's the twist. Serving venison also carried social weight. In England, hunting was restricted to the aristocracy. Commoners who poached deer faced severe punishment, fines, imprisonment, even death for repeat offenders. Game laws protected the nobility's privilege, ensuring that only those with land and title could enjoy wild meat. But in America, any man with a rifle could hunt. Franklin loved that democratization of privilege. A venison roast at his table wasn't just food. It was a statement about who Americans were becoming. Free, independent, and answerable to no king. Every bite represented a liberty unknown to most Europeans. The very act of serving wild game to guests from all social classes, tradesmen sitting beside gentlemen, all enjoying the same venison, embodied Franklin's vision of a more equal society. He understood that in Europe, what you ate reflected your status. Nobles ate game, while commoners ate mutton. In America, Franklin hoped to create something different, not perfect equality, he remained pragmatic about human nature, but a society where merit mattered more than birth, where a printer's son could dine on venison and discuss philosophy with anyone who brought intelligence to the table. Kidney pie with rich gravy. Franklin's appreciation for using every part of an animal extended to organ meats. Kidney pie, a dish common in British cuisine but adapted by colonial cooks, appeared at his table as both economy and indulgence. Kidneys, often discarded or sold cheap, became the foundation for a rich, savory pie when combined with gravy, onions, and enclosed in pastry. This wasn't poverty food on Franklin's table, it was culinary intelligence. Picture the scene. A golden-crusted pie, broken open, steam rising, revealing tender kidneys in thick, dark gravy. Diplomatic setbacks became chances to adjust strategy. Even his famous kite experiment emerged from resourcefulness, using everyday materials to probe nature's mysteries. A kidney pie on his table sent a message to guests. Intelligence and effort could transform anything. What seemed worthless to the careless became valuable to the skilled. America itself followed this pattern. Europeans saw the colonies as provincial backwaters, useful only for resources. Franklin saw potential. Raw materials, yes, but also minds ready to learn, hands ready to build, and a future waiting to be shaped. Madeira wine with nuts and cheese. No meal at Franklin's table ended without wine, and his favorite was Madeira. This fortified wine from Portugal's Madeira Islands became the drink of choice in colonial America, prized for its ability to survive long ocean voyages without spoiling. Franklin kept bottles of Madeira in his cellar and served it with nuts and cheese, creating a closing course that encouraged lingering conversation. Picture the scene. Dinner plates cleared away, guests settling deeper into their chairs, Franklin pouring amber Madeira into glasses, passing platters of walnuts, almonds, and slices of aged cheese. The wine's rich, slightly sweet flavor paired perfectly with the sharp cheese and crunchy nuts. But more importantly, it created space for the real purpose of Franklin's dinners: ideas. Madeira's history made it particularly American. The wine gained its distinctive character from long sea voyages. Barrels stored in shipholds, rocked by waves and warmed by tropical sun, developed complex flavors impossible to achieve in cellars. What began as accident became method. Winemakers realized that rough treatment improved the wine. America's own journey followed a similar pattern. Adversity, creating strength. The ritual of serving Madeira with nuts and cheese had practical benefits. The wine's alcohol content kept conversation flowing without making guests drunk quickly. The food encouraged lingering. Cracking nuts took time. Cheese required slow savoring. Together, they created an atmosphere where talk mattered more than eating. Here's the kicker. Madeira wasn't just a drink. It was a diplomatic tool. In Paris, London, and Philadelphia, Franklin used these intimate post-dinner moments to discuss philosophy, politics, and revolution. The wine relaxed guards, the cheese and nuts kept hands busy, and conversations flowed freely. Some of the most important ideas that shaped American independence were debated over glasses of Madeira. Franklin understood that changing minds happened gradually. You couldn't force someone to accept radical ideas through argument alone. But sitting together, sharing good wine and food, talking long into the evening, that created the conditions for transformation. A British official who might reflexively defend Parliament's right to tax the colonies could, after 3 glasses of Madeira and 2 hours of conversation, begin questioning assumptions he'd never examined before. The nuts and cheese served practical purposes beyond occupation. Walnuts and almonds provided substance, preventing the wine from going to anyone's head too quickly. Aged cheese, sharp cheddar from Pennsylvania farms or imported Stilton, paired with Madeira's sweetness, creating flavor contrasts that kept palates interested, and both required no preparation, meaning Franklin could focus on conversation rather than coordinating courses. Fresh bread with butter. For all the exotic dishes, scientific experiments, and diplomatic feasts, Franklin's table always returned to one fundamental truth: fresh bread with butter. This most basic of foods appeared at every meal, from simple breakfasts to elaborate dinners. And in its simplicity lay everything Franklin believed about food and life. Picture a loaf pulled from the oven, its crust golden and cracking, steam rising when broken open, a pat of fresh butter melting into the warm interior. Nothing fancy, nothing imported. Nothing that required wealth or connections, just grain, water, yeast, and butter. The building blocks of civilization itself. The bread at Franklin's table came from local bakeries or his own kitchen. Pennsylvania wheat, grown in rich soil, milled into flour, mixed with water and salt, left to rise, then baked in brick ovens until the crust developed that perfect crackling exterior. The smell alone could make guests lean forward before the bread reached the table. And when broken open, the interior was soft, slightly chewy, full of irregular holes where yeast had done its work. Butter completed the picture. Not the pale, flavorless butter of modern supermarkets, but rich yellow butter from cows that ate grass, packed with flavor. At room temperature, it spread easily across warm bread, melting into the crumb, enriching every bite. This combination, bread and butter, represented sustenance at its most basic and most satisfying. Here's what most people miss. Franklin saw bread as democracy in edible form. Rich and poor alike ate it. It could be simple or elevated, depending on the skill of the baker and the quality of ingredients, but fundamentally, everyone had access to it. And that mattered to Franklin. He believed America should be a place where even the humblest citizen could live with dignity, and that began with something as simple as good bread. His writings overflow with bread metaphors. In Poor Richard's Almanac, bread appears constantly. Bread is the staff of life. Eat to live, not live to eat. He that has lost his credit is dead to the world. But Franklin meant these more literally than most readers realized. Bread represented sustenance, yes, but also honest work, fair exchange, and social trust. A baker who sold good bread at fair prices contributed to his community's well-being. He fed people, yes, but also demonstrated that commerce could be honest, that quality mattered, that reputation meant something. A baker who cheated, short waits, poor ingredients, high prices, damaged more than his customers' meals. He eroded social trust, the foundation of any functioning society. In his writings, Franklin repeatedly returned to bread as metaphor. Earning your bread meant working honestly. Breaking bread meant building community. And having enough bread meant a society was functioning properly. At his table, that fresh loaf wasn't an afterthought. It was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Think about the symbolism. Bread required cooperation. Farmers grew grain. Millers ground flour, bakers turned flour into loaves. Customers paid honest prices. Each step demanded trust. Farmers trusted millers to pay fairly and not steal grain. Millers trusted bakers to buy regularly. Bakers trusted customers to pay. And everyone trusted that bread would be bread. Wholesome, nourishing, honest. Franklin saw this chain of trust as civilization itself. When it worked, societies flourished. When it broke, everything collapsed. Bread shortages toppled governments. Bread riots sparked revolutions. Control the bread supply, and you controlled populations. Make bread abundant and affordable, and you created stability. At his table, passing fresh bread to guests, represented Franklin's deepest hopes for America, that it would be a place where honest work earned honest reward, where cooperation mattered more than competition, where even the simplest things, bread, butter, a shared meal, reminded people of their common humanity. The reminder that for all his experiments with tofu and parmesan, all his diplomatic champagne toasts and scientific custards, the real work of building a nation happened in everyday choices, everyday meals, everyday acts of feeding yourself and others with care. Bread was where that work began and ended. Simple, essential, democratic. The perfect symbol for the country Franklin helped create. Sitting at his table, you weren't just fed. You were reminded that America could thrive on its own, with flavors as bold, resourceful, and inventive as the man himself. Franklin's table was where independence tasted like maple syrup, where revolution simmered in pepper pot, and where the future of a nation was built one meal, one conversation, one shared plate at a time. 30 dishes that changed history, served by a man who understood that the way we eat reveals everything about who we are and who we hope to become.